Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Easy Conversations, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dandia. In this week's episode, I sit down with Alistair Moes from Moes Anger Management, and we talk about anger and how to normalize the whole conversation around anger. Alistair shares how over 26 years that he's been doing work in anger management, how he's seen a significant transition around the stigma of speaking about anger. We still have a long ways to go, as there is still a lot of issues for men being able to speak about their challenges with anger. And the same applies to women. And one of the key things we touch on is becoming aware of some of those patterns and working through them, and how to be mindful of them when they do arise. I hope you can get a lot out of this episode, and if at the end you could leave a review, I would truly appreciate it. Alistair, thanks for joining the podcast today. I appreciate you taking the time. Super grateful for you to come on here and share your story. But just to get started, I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about yourself, and then kind of where I found you was obviously on Instagram through your account there and the Anger Man program. So I wanted to tap into that a little bit and understand what Anger Man's all about. But just to kind of give you an opportunity to introduce yourself first.
All right. Well, I've been running the Moes Anger Management for the last 26 years, and it's called Moes because my last name is pronounced Moes. It's Dutch, and it's not spelled that way, but we thought we'd just go for that.
Yeah.
And it's good to have a bit of humor in this field, in my humble opinion. And one of the things that inspired me in this direction is because I come from a family where nobody spoke about anything. I mean, really, some bad stuff happened and just nobody ever talked about it.
Yeah.
And in 1979, when I was 18, which makes me 59 right now, my mom very suddenly died. And like literally walking down the street one moment, the next thing she's dead. And my dad did not have a funeral. She had a brain aneurysm, and he just didn't talk about it. I mean, literally, with me and my two brothers, just didn't talk about it. He took us to Hawaii for Christmas, but we didn't talk about it there either. And so I come from this family where nobody ever talks about stuff, and I just knew all the way along, like, there's something really deeply wrong with this, but I didn't understand it. And I spent about 10 years bartending and managing bars, which helped me avoid talking about it all. But somehow I got a degree in psychology through all that, and got into the field. And in '95 started running these groups, almost by accident. But I found that the people who came to the groups enjoyed it, and so did I. And the more I studied on stuff around anger management, the more I realized, wow, my role models, my parents, did not have anger management dialed in completely. Like when I grew up in a household where everything was ignored. So if there was a big blow up one night, things are getting broken. The next morning, everybody just pretends like nothing happened.
Yeah.
Which, as a kid, I'm like, cool, right? What do I know? I just want to be a kid. But it kind of led me to follow that up as an adult, where if I did something completely irresponsible, I would expect that the next day, whoever my partner was would just like pretend like nothing happened, which is not what actually happened all the time. Mm-hmm. And then running these groups, I realized, wow, I've got a lot to learn. So I was up to that task, and so I've done a lot of training. I've worked with thousands of people over the years, and I continue to run lots of groups. We have people from all over the world come to see us. They're showing up on on Zoom. I have one guy in my current group who's in Saudi Arabia, not Saudi Arabia, but somewhere in the Middle East, and I talked to a guy yesterday in Bermuda, and so we're working with all sorts of people. There's 8 of us, and my partner Alejandra runs women's groups, which have become increasingly popular. Like, I think it's becoming more okay for women to talk about their anger. So men, most of us, me, as an example, grew up learning that we're not supposed to talk about the emotions at all. And except maybe we can display anger or aggression.
Right.
That's
Yes.
kind of manly. But we're not going to talk about our shame or pain or fear or anxiety. We're just going to talk about anger or, being
Right.
competitive or something like that. Whereas women grow up, more often with generalizing that they're allowed to talk about the wide range of emotions, except for anger. Right? Women, historically have not been encouraged to show anger.
Right.
In fact, history is that if you describe an angry man, people think, wow, he's perhaps even powerful or passionate might be used, right? Whereas if a woman is showing a lot of anger, passionate is not a word that people use in general.
Right.
Crazy, unhinged, things like that. And of course, women and men both feel all the same emotions. And so women are becoming more comfortable talking about anger, and it's important. Just as men, I think over the years are becoming more comfortable talking about the whole range of emotions.
Right.
And yeah, we've got a whole team of people. We see people all over the world, as I said, and there's always more training to do. Even this later this month, I'm doing some training called somatic experiencing, which is based on the work of Peter Levine, who is kind of like the godfather of trauma work. He started working with trauma in the 60s. So this is like the third sort of batch of training on that one. And anyway, I can go on and on about this, but that's sort of in a nutshell where I come from, and some of the fact that nobody spoke about anything in my family growing up led me to end up having a career where we talk about all sorts of stuff and acknowledge, I acknowledge the historic trauma in my family, which I know is like, my family is pretty normal. The guys that show up in our groups, just a normal, well, most of them, just a normal looking bunch of guys from every walk of life, every background, rich, poor, doesn't matter what you're, where you come from. Anger is in all of us.
Right.
And it isn't a bad thing. It's just an emotion like any other emotion, right? If somebody comes in and says, oh, I never get angry, my thoughts are, I'm sorry. That must be stuck, because people are probably walking all over you. Anger is sometimes called the guardian of our boundaries. So if somebody mistreats you, transgresses your boundaries, or those of somebody you care of, or something that you care about, anger is there, right? It's very physical in us. It rises up like heat, or this emotion just moves us to act. It's like there's this life energy in anger. And if we're wise and deliberate with our response, thoughtful, heart connected, then we can respond with dignity, assertively, and speak up well. Of course, what brings people our way is that they did not pause, they did not take the time to really think through how to respond. And especially in this time of the pandemic, everybody's already kind of elevated, and extra stress on top of that means people are more likely to react.
For sure.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. No, and that's great that I think there's many, many points you touched on, and I definitely have a lot of questions for you. But one of the things you mentioned was, it's okay for men to display anger and not for women. So there's a shaming of women displaying anger, and then there's the shaming around men expressing emotions, right? And I think what you touched on also was there's nothing wrong with being angry. It's how it's expressed or how it comes out. And I think
it can actually be a really vulnerable emotion.
hmm and I think part of the work you guys do is helping people regulate that emotion and how they're expressing it, right?
Sure, yeah.
You've noticed from when you first started working with men in group counseling, and what you see now, like, almost 30 years later. Yeah, like, do you mind?
Don't remind me. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to get your thoughts on that, because I think it's important to note how far we've come, over the years.
Sure. Well, definitely men have changed. I've seen lots of, when I asked groups in the 90s if they had practiced meditation, or if they had done breathing exercises, I might have a room with 15 guys in it, and maybe one guy would put his hand up. And so it's rare now if less than half of the room put their hand up. And there's usually at least one or two guys in there with a regular meditation practice, not always. And it depends a bit where the group takes place. When we were doing in-person groups, more meditators would be in the downtown core of Vancouver compared to if I was looking at a group in one of the suburbs. And a couple other things come to mind. One is that when I would ask men, one of the things that I noticed was that when men answer questions about communication, and I would ask guys, what does good communication look like? What are all the things involved in communication? And guys would, in the 90s, they would just talk about how to get this point across. But somewhere around the year 2000, a change happened, and guys started to say, listening was part of communication. And so since that time, usually if I ask that question with a group, at least a couple of the first 5 answers include things like active listening, or that it's a dialogue rather than trying to get your point across. And last night I was running a group, and so many of the men make goals that are, I'm going to stop telling people what to do, and I'm just going to listen.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically their partner, but other people as well, but their partner, giving that person the experience of being really heard, seen, and that their words are valued, rather than interrupting, talking over, finishing sentences, just hearing the first few words and coming up with your answer and just waiting to get it in, actually really hearing the other person and then coming up with a response, or even asking if they want, the person's advice, or do they just want to listen, which can be pretty powerful. Sometimes people just want to be heard.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that's really come up, I think, maybe in the last 10 years, is that when I ask guys to talk about the destructive response to anger, because part of the approach we bring is that you want to know what a destructive response to anger feels like, sounds like, how that inhabits you, as just as much as you want to understand the constructive response. what that feels like in your body, in your thoughts, and what your experience is when you go down that path, so to speak. And the guys much more often these days talk about the destructive path, including fear, anxiety, sometimes shame, and those things never used to come up. So my experience is it's more vulnerability. And I regularly have people join me, um, as far as I'm training somebody to work with our company, um, or sometimes as sometimes somebody has a practicum with us, they'll sit in with me, and often it's women or um, so somewhere other than just male on that gender spectrum. And often uh, people are surprised at how vulnerable the men are, how sincere they come across as what they're trying to do with their relationship, and how vulnerable they are looking at their own stuff and sharing with the group. And so we'll spend half of every group just guys what each other is working on and what's having a positive impact, and what's not working as well.
Mm-hmm.
So those things are changing, and I think continue to change. And all those historic uh, messages we got growing up about what it means to be a man is still there.
Yeah.
Just, to be clear, that stuff is still there. When I talked with my son about this when he was going through high school, I said to him, so my my understanding is, because I'm a long way removed from high school, is that in elementary school, boys in grade, 3, 4, 5, and younger will walk down the hallway, arm in arm, their buddy will talk to each other. Generalizing here, of course. But when they get to high school, they're not going to put their arms around each other unless they're wrestling or playing football or something aggressive. So they're not going to touch each other. It's okay to be gay, they'll say, but I don't want people to think I'm gay. And they stop talking to each other. Like they stop really sharing vulnerable about things, about their fear, about their worry, and they start to take on that manly persona where they're tough.
Yeah, no, and I think you've touched on a few important things, and a lot of the stigma around men being vulnerable still exists, and there's a lot of things that have changed. And I think the whole concept of listening, as you mentioned, often, even myself, I get stuck in it, is where I'm, whether it's my partner talking to me or someone else, I'm just waiting for them to finish so I can fire back with my own story, my own argument, my own point, and I'm not really listening. I'm just waiting. I'm listening for them to stop talking so I can jump in, but it's not really listening in terms of wanting to hear the other person, what they want, what they need, what are they trying to say, how can I be supportive. And unfortunately, and again, for me, that's something I've been working on this year, is just stepping away and looking at it more of okay, how can I be the most supportive right now? Or how can I be the best person right now, in terms of just hearing what the other person needs or what they're trying to convey?
Well, and that practice of pausing, about stepping back, reflecting rather than reacting, is something, because I was running a group last night and we were talking about the different goals that each person comes up with. And so much of it is about slowing things down so that they use their intelligence, so that they're connected to their heart rather than history. So often, many of us grew up in families where our fathers and maybe our mothers as well didn't really stop and think things through. They open their mouth and things blurted out, at least some of the time. And so that's becomes our default, and we follow up on that. And many of the men that attend our groups, um, they experienced addictions, among other things. Not all, of course, but some of them, bad things happened when they were growing up, and people were reactive. They didn't think things through, and that just inhabits their body, and so it becomes our default. And unless we're really taking the time to investigate this stuff, we just recreate it.
Mm-hmm.
And we all recreate some of it, and maybe some of it was good, but even the good stuff, we want to be intentional and aware of it.
Yes.
And so if we have a partner who we can have conversations with, where we can understand each of our family histories and what we learned, and do so without personalizing things, with just being curious, then we can really get to know each other and ourselves a lot better. And usually we need some help along that way. I've had lots of help.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. Absolutely. And I think one of the things you and I have spoken about last time was, even like when we're having those conversations with, whether it's our partner or family members, knowing when to take a break.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if, I mean, most of the time we can tell when we're getting escalated. Your face starts turning red, and you're just boiling. And those are the moments where we need to practice that, kind of taking that pause, and whether it's stepping away, and coming back, or it's expressing that I'm flooded right now and I need to take a break here. I think it's important, whether it's in your romantic relationships or even with family members. I quite often find, my parents will frustrate me more than my partner. So it's being aware. And like, what kind of stuff have you seen, and what do you advise the people that come to you for help or therapy?
So there's a couple of videos on my website and on YouTube titled The Arousal Cycle, Part 1 and Part 2. And it shows me presenting the first session of the group. And I go into a lot of stuff around physiology. So what's happening in our body and in our brain, and hormones and chemical changes in different parts of the body as we escalate. And it's great when we have, one partner attend the men's group, one partner attend the women's group, depending. Sometimes we'll have both women, partners attend different women's groups, because it's better they attend different ones, or men's groups. But when they both are dialed into what's happening in their body and the physiology, and they're both more aware of when they are flooded, when they've escalated, the blood vessels leading to the high reasoning part of the brain have constricted. We're shutting off the blood flow. We're becoming dumber. That's why we can't think straight. And if we can acknowledge that without shame, and tell our partner, I need a timeout. I can't even think straight right now. And so we have a couple of pages titled The Timeout. And the idea is that each person agrees with this, or they alter it so that they agree, and that they support each other.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just an acknowledgement. I'm not capable of dealing with this right now. So let's take a break. And that seems to help quite a bit. And what's going to be successful for one person isn't necessarily going to be successful for another. So you never really know what's going to work. So I had a guy, and I know he'd be fine with me sharing the example. He said, so he says, so this last week, and we were talking about vulnerability. The check-in was, what's the most vulnerable thing you've done in the last 6 weeks? The
Mhm.
last check-in of the group. And he says, so I had this conversation with my wife, and she just poured her guts out to me. And I just did everything I could to listen. I didn't want to interrupt her. I didn't want to add in my 2 bits. I just wanted to be there for her. And so I did the breathing exercises. Now that helped keep me more grounded. And I did some other stuff just so that I could stay really present. And I said, well, what was the other stuff you did? And he smiles and he says, well, I'm a Simpsons fan. And I don't know if you're a Simpsons fan, he says, but there's this image of Homer where he's got this monkey, showing what's going on in his brain. There's this monkey dancing around with like little symbols on his fingers. And that's what I was thinking of so that I could stay present. And everybody cracked up, of course, in the group. But like he could feel himself escalating, and that helped him just bring it back down.
Yeah.
And then he could be there for her.
Yeah.
So you never know what's actually going to work, but people need to try something different. And it took him, I'm sure, a lot of courage and effort just to stay there. But, it was because he loves her and he wants this relationship to work. And, that monkey dancing around in his brain helped.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way of kind of de-escalating is finding humor in your head, right?
Yeah.
I think on the arousal thing, I do find it quite fascinating because it is almost addictive, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
when you've got that cortisol coming, you almost start craving that high that you feel when you're aroused. But I think
the adrenaline really kicks in,
mm-hmm.
and we feel more powerful. And sometimes it helps people feel like they have clarity because everything becomes all or nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have all that gray area, and all of a sudden we feel stronger, more powerful, and this can be, addicting.
Yeah, and I think most people are almost deceived by that feeling because they feel they're in control, and when in fact it's quite the opposite. You're not in control. You're almost out of control because of how you're reacting when you're aroused, or you're making impulsive decisions, and obviously, like, that's not something you want to do. Maybe for some things it may work, but not when you're dealing with or in conversation in your relationships. It's probably not the best state to be in. But yeah.
Well, and so the more we escalate, the more our emotional maturity level drops, typically,
Mm-hmm.
generalizing. But if we get really, peaked, we're really escalated, we're really wound up. If I'm talking with somebody about that sort of situation, sometimes they'll say, well, in that moment, what would you say your emotional maturity level was in years of age? How
Yeah.
old was that? And if they're really honest, they'll say, well, 2, 3, 5, 8.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter. All we know is it's like this young part of us is running the show in that moment. And there's nothing wrong with having access to this younger part of us. If you have kids, or even if you don't have kids, if you're just being silly or having fun, or you're being creative or what have you, having access to this can be super helpful. But in those moments, it's like the adult is still present.
Mm-hmm.
Where when we're really losing it, it's like the adult left the building, leaving this little kid in charge, and that little kid is emotionally ill-equipped to deal with the complexities of our adult life. And so he acts like a big baby, which
Mm-hmm.
is, so sometimes my wife will say, so what age are you right now? None of your business. 4 or 5. But usually that's just, we're just having fun when we're doing that. Usually.
Right, right. And do you feel like and I mean I can completely agree with that, because I feel like I turn 4 or 5 when I'm escalated. But is that something you need to be aware of and pause, or is that, like, based on kind of the work I've done, I've realized that that's something you can even mitigate completely, in the sense of attending to whatever needs you had when you go back to being 4 or 5, like basically, nurturing that child inside of you, so he or she doesn't keep coming back when you're in those moments of being flooded. um, what are your thoughts on that? Like, I feel like a lot of the therapy people do is to deal with some of those the child inside of us, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's different ways to work with that. One of them is doing what's sometimes called shadow work or gestalt therapy, which I think you're familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll have the person switch between 2 chairs, or sometimes even just switch in the chair that they're in because it's online, or I worked with somebody who was sitting in the car and they had to go from one seat to the other, not while they're driving, and to work on the relationship and understanding that part of them, because there's nothing wrong with that part
Yeah.
of them, but typically, typically something happened at some point in their life and there's some trauma in there, and there's some stuckness there, and getting to know that part can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a real physical component to that, and so sometimes I'll just work with the physical component, and so it's like we can have the person step near or a little bit into their trauma and just be with that and then step back out. So it's practicing being with it, and then bringing yourself back. So bringing your heart rate down and your blood pressure down, and re-grounding yourself and getting better at being with what's there, becoming more aware of it, because there's a real physical element to it. And another thing is just to have them have a conversation with that part of them, and build more compassion for that part of them, so they don't beat themselves up because they have this part of them wants to react this way.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Mm-hmm.
nothing wrong with the fact that they react. Part of them wants to react, but it's like, let's get to know this. Let's get to know the history of it and figure out what they probably needed at the time where that first occurred, whatever that learning was. Like when I was 4 years old, we were living in South America, in Santiago in Chile.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, my older brother and I were shipped off to Holland. My dad flew us in 1966 or 67, flew to Holland in South America. It must have been a hell of a flight, and left us with people I'd never met before. Fortunately, they were nice. And, they had a nice house and all that stuff. But being left separate from your parents does some damage to a kid. Like there's a trauma there. And so after my dad came and picked us up 6 months later, and we moved to Vancouver, then I was thinking as a little kid, well, whatever I did wrong, I better not do that again. Right? So there's this shame, like something's wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
I need to be careful, anxious, or, so you come up with this anxious attachment.
Yes.
Like it's the end of the world if the relationship goes sideways. And so you pour everything into relationships, even when they're clearly doomed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, when I look back from my perspective now, I'm like, whoa, you know, those red flags were all over the place, but I chose to not see them and
Mm-hmm.
stay in the relationship.
Yeah.
But when I got to understand this anxious part of me and where it came from and do work with it, um, then that can change so that I can feel more secure in myself and not run by that young part of me that really needed love and compassion and safety and security.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't really available at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I can completely relate. I have anxious attachment too. So I hear where you're coming from. And I think part of it is becoming aware of it in itself. I find like now the fact that I'm aware of why I start feeling anxious, I'm like, oh, it's because of my attachment style. It just helps me process it even better, because now that I know what it is, before I didn't even know what it was, and I just kind of defaulted to maladaptive coping mechanisms. And now that I'm aware, I'm like, okay, you know what, this is what it is. It will pass.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a wave. And before it was like, oh my God, this is the end of the world. And
Mhm.
I'm never going to find anybody else. And I'm going to die alone. Die really soon, too. We're not really thinking, but the
Right.
4 or 5 year old, definitely that's where that thinking goes, which is why we go so much into fight or flight and it's like the end of the world when it's not. And
Hmm.
so being able to take that perspective, pull back and notice, I think meditation helps a lot with that too. Just noticing what's happening in your body, your breathing, just
Yeah,
being more aware of that just takes practice.
for sure, for sure. And I mean, going back to the whole aspect of anger, and like I've spoken to many people, and it's again taking that time to really differentiate between anger and kind of the reaction that comes from it, and getting people to understand that there's nothing wrong with anger. Again, there's this whole stigma around people being angry and how they're perceived, versus the whole concept of how people react when they're angry. And you and I have also chatted about that. But what are your thoughts, and like, what do you tell people that come to you in terms of normalizing the whole emotion of anger, but finding healthy ways to deal with it?
Well, and part of that is reflecting upon what you learned growing up about anger.
Mm-hmm.
Was anger allowed? Certainly for somebody socialized as a boy growing up, it was probably a lot more allowed than somebody socialized as a girl.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends. That's why we have women's groups and men's groups, because there's different learning. It generalizing, of course, but they're looking at that. But anger is just like any other emotion. We can do something healthy or we can do something unhealthy.
Mm-hmm.
And anger is data. It is informing us that something's wrong, and our job is to investigate that, be curious about it, to figure out what am I feeling so angry about. But taking the time, whereas usually when people come to see us, when somebody calls, almost 99 times out of 100, something pretty bad is happening. People don't usually call us to prevent it.
Mm-hmm. It's
And
yeah.
that morning that they woke up, before they blew up, um, they hadn't slept well, they'd been totally stressed. Maybe there'd been, like, I don't know, a worldwide pandemic going on for about a year. Just there's usually, there's financial struggles, but there's all these layers, and it left them reacting poorly. Because on top of the anger, there's frustration, there's anxiety, maybe there's shame, money troubles, or what have you. And those things, the anger can move us to do something with our intelligence, with our heart, with some self-awareness of what's going on in the body, and we can actually become more focused, determined, or we can react in the moment and not think things through, which is, of course, what brings people our way. All of us have that experience that we reacted, said something we regret, or done things we regret, many things that we've regretted. I'm almost 60, so I've done more regrettable things than somebody younger. And I'm okay with that, right? It's part of life. And do we learn from those things? Do we face them and grow from them? Because that's what we need to do with the anger, is face it and own it, and really put the time and effort into just knowing it's yours, right? My job is to own my own anger and make sure that I can express it clearly and directly at the right time with the right person. Because for me growing up, I didn't learn any of that. I learned you suppress it all and then you totally blow up at random moments, or you become manipulative and blame and shame somebody or what have you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's
I got some good stuff too, but I got a lot of not so good stuff.
No, and I think that's important. I think the things you touched on, especially around learning from those experiences, because otherwise there's no, at any point when you do have certain opportunities for growth, you want to be able to learn from the experiences where you probably weren't your best. And if you're not learning from those, then it's almost, I would consider it was for nothing, right? You didn't really take that opportunity to learn and do something different next time.
Well, and we are creatures of habit.
Yes.
So the most likely thing is that we make the same mistake over and over and over again. And so when I hear a guy last night talking in a group saying, I'm meditating every day and I'm really practicing this because I've done this before where I've meditated and things have gone well. And then some period of months has gone by and then I'm like, cool, I've got this totally figured out. That's the misstep. And he says, now I want to make sure that I just make this part of my life permanently, because I know the most likely future is our past. Unless we really implement serious long-term change and keep on investing, putting that time and energy into personal growth, into being aware, of being intentional with those that we care about, and ourselves and how we respond anywhere in the world. That's not easy stuff, but it's a worthwhile investment.
Yeah, no, for sure. Alistair, I want to thank you again for doing this. I know it took us a couple of tries, but again, appreciate you taking the time and super grateful. I guess for my listeners who want to get a hold of you or find you on whether it's social media or online, what are some of the best ways to get a hold of you?
Moes Anger Management is Instagram, and angerman.online or angerman.ca will get you to my website, and there's all sorts of videos and podcasts and stuff like that there, and which is where this one will be as well. And the old-fashioned 604-723-5134, the phone number. But all that information's on the website, and we're on Facebook, Moes Anger Management. So we're all over the place. And 26 years of running this, and it's good to see more and more change. And I think more and more men are talking about these things. So I really kudos to you, appreciation for talking about this. The world needs more men talking about this, and women too. There's more and more women attending our women's groups.
Mm-hmm.
It's women's get different messages, and I think it's just we need to become more sophisticated in our connection with all the emotions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I guess if people are interested, you're also, I'm assuming, offering online group sessions right now, considering everything going on as well, right? So
Yeah, we have people all across Canada. Last night there was a guy in Florida. Yesterday I saw a guy in Bermuda, a guy in Saudi Arabia, and the group actually last night too, I think. So there's people all over the planet. A little harder in Saudi Arabia. It's 5:30 in the morning rather than 6:30 in the evening.
mm-hmm.
So, but he is dedicated. So yeah, people are welcome, and we have a team of counselors that work with people individually as well, men and women, etc.
No, that's really cool. Again, thank you. And I'm sure we'll be in touch.
I would like that, and
Yeah.
maybe we'll have a follow-up somewhere down the road here.
Well, that's the end of the episode. Thank you again for tuning in and showing your support. Until next week.